Hey guys, and I use the word guys in a generic way. It means men and women. And I think this video is being played for the pastor's breakfast. I would give anything if I could be there. And I'd planned on being there. I was going to the local Publix to get some milk, and I slipped over a concrete barrier in front of my car. And I fell, and when an old guy falls, people surround him quickly. And I didn't go all the way down, but I hit a car and hit my ribs. To make a long story short, I ended up in the emergency room with x-rays and tests, and I found out to my horror that if I cough, I think I'm going to die. And if I breathe too deeply, exactly the same thing happens. So the president of Key Life made a decision that he wasn't going to let me go to be with you guys in Connecticut. And I just hate it. And especially for this pastor's breakfast, because I foresaw what we were going to do, and that was we were going to discuss some things. I'm going to say some fairly controversial things. I've been teaching students for 100 years on practical theology and how to win the battles in the church without losing your salvation. And I thought I'd talk to you just a little bit about that, and maybe it will gender discussion after I finish. Before we start, let me thank two guys that have come over to my home, and they're videoing and audioing this so you can see it. One is Matthew Porter, and Matthew is a vice president at Key Life, and he's executive producer of our talk show, and he's got his fingers in a lot of pies, and he took time from a busy schedule to do this. And I appreciate it. The other guy is John Myers, and he's a technical wizard. He's our IT guy, and he oversees video and audio, and sometimes he's so good, I think that he's demon-possessed. At any rate, these two guys came over to do this so I could talk to you during this breakfast, and I just wanted to say thank you to them. Number of years ago, when I was teaching at Reformed Theological Seminary, one of the things that we noticed about former students is that a lot of them were getting into trouble. They went into the church with high hopes that there would be revival as they taught God's word, that they were going to make an impact on a lot of lives, and then they ran up against a brick wall. And in fact, a number of those students even left the ministry because of the hardness, because of the opposition that they were experiencing in the church. And during that faculty meeting, we talked about what could be done about it. And the faculty then decided it was to be my responsibility. And so I designed a practical course for pastors on how to survive in the church without losing your salvation. Some of it was pretty harsh. Some of it sounded pretty manipulative, and you're going to feel that way with some of the things that I'm going to teach during this breakfast. But I used to say to the students, be quiet, take notes, because you're going to be tested on this, and the day will come when you'll call me and say, Steve, you remember how upset I was with what you were teaching? Well, I just want you to know you saved my posterior, and you said I would thank you, and that's what I'm doing today. The church is a hard place to be, especially for pastors. And there's some people in the church who just don't like you and would like to see you leave. And maybe you're in that situation. And if not, maybe you will be, and I'm going to teach you 2 or 3 things that maybe you can discuss and with which you might even disagree. but they are important. Let me read to you a text, and I'm not going to so much expound that text as I am just going to read it to you to give you a flavor of the other things I'm going to be saying, and you know that Jesus has similar feelings about his leaders. This is from Matthew, the 10th chapter, and I'm going to start reading at the 8th verse. These 12 Jesus sent out, instructing them, "Go nowhere among the Gentiles, and enter no town of the Samaritans, but go rather to the lost sheep of the house of Israel, and proclaim as you go, saying, the kingdom of heaven is at hand. Heal the sick, raise the dead, cleanse lepers, cast out demons. You received without paying, give without pay. Acquire no gold, nor silver, nor copper for your belts, no bag for your journey, nor 2 tunics, nor sandals, nor a staff, for the laborer deserves his food. And whatever town or village you enter, find out who is worthy, and stay there until you depart. As you enter the house, greet it, and if the house is worthy, let your peace be upon it. But if it is not worthy, let your peace return to you. And if anyone will not receive you or listen to your words, shake the dust from your feet when you leave that house or town. And truly I say to you, it will be more bearable on the day of judgment for the land of Sodom and Gomorrah than for that town." Some things that you might be helpful and are kind of surprising is, first, you got to develop a mean streak. But the mean streak has to be ameliorated with a servant streak. One of the things in our culture, because of the criticism that's being leveled at evangelical churches, one of the things happening in our culture is that pastors have been intimidated into being weenies. A number of years ago, I wrote a book called No More Mr. Nice Guy. That was published by Nelson, and it was written for pastors, but Nelson decided the market wasn't big enough, and so they wanted to PR that book in a lot of different circles. The theme of the book was Christian boldness. Let me tell you where it started. I was meeting with a pastor in, I think, Virginia or North Carolina at a conference where I was speaking. And we had lunch, and he was telling me that the elders of his church were requiring that he send his sermon to his predecessor for a critique. I listened to that and couldn't believe it. And I said, tell him where to go. I was a little more upfront with those words during that time. And he said to me, Steve, that's something you would do. I can't do that. And I said, if you can't do it, you're not going to be a pastor for very long. And within a year, he was no longer in ministry. What was his problem? His problem was he didn't have a mean streak. That's what his problem was. And when I say mean streak, I say that because when I say it, it makes you think. I'm not talking about a mean streak that is a pagan mean streak. I'm talking about steel in your backbone, where you lead, where you're willing to go in controversial areas, where you're willing to sit down with people who disagree with you and confront. It's a time when you decide, I am God's man and I'm a leader. In the preaching classes that I used to teach, I would tell students who were pretty nervous about their first time preaching, Listen, say to yourself when you get up to preach, get out of my way. I'm anointed by the God of the universe, and by God's grace, you will listen to me because I have a message from him. And the students used to say, oh man, that doesn't sound Christian. And I would say, look, say it anyway to yourself and then repent later if you feel you have to do that. I wrote that book because it was really important that pastors not be intimidated, that they be strong, that they lead, that they be the one that people look to for guidance, because that's where we are called. But you got to balance that out with being a servant. If you don't, you'll just be a monster. My friend, the late Ben Hayden, who was the pastor at First Presbyterian in Chattanooga, was my friend for 40 years, and I still miss him. I used to go up to that church and do a week Bible conference or a missions conference for him. And the first time I went to that church, I was picked up at the airport by one of the elders. And I did what I often do in that particular kind of setting. I asked him what he thought about his pastor. And generally, when I ask that question of lay people in the church, I can discern what's going on in the church. If they say, I don't like him, he's a good man, but he's got a lot to learn, I know there's trouble. If they say, on the other hand, oh man, we have the best pastor in the entire state, we are so fortunate to have this pastor, then I know some health is going on in this church. But this time, when I went to Ben's church for the first time, it was a little bit different. I said, what do you think about your pastor? And the guy said, I hate him. I said, you hate him? He said, yeah, I don't like the way he parts his hair. I don't like the way he talks. But let me tell you something, Mr. Brown. I will follow him through a wall. When my mother was sick and dying, he stayed by her bed every day for 3 solid days and nights. And I don't care where he goes, I'll follow him. I don't care what he tells me to do, I'll do it. And I pray for him every day, and am so glad for him. You see, what happened there is that the leadership was mixed with a mean streak, but also with servanthood. If you knew Ben Hayden, you know how strong he was. He taught me when I was a young pastor, he said, Steve, you got to be strong because it's not right, but people will think of God the way they think of you. If they can manipulate you, if they can use you as a doormat, they'll think they can do that with God. So make sure you're strong. I've followed that my whole ministry, but I've also seen the other side. Will Campbell was at one time, the late Will Campbell. Almost everybody I know is dead. Will Campbell was a magnificent man of God who worked in racial reconciliation. And he was white, and the black community accepted him. And they understood what he was doing, but they said to him, Will, what are you going to say to those white folks? They're not going to listen to a word you say. And Will Campbell said, I'm going over there and I'm going to wash the bedpans of their sick. That was the servanthood that has great power. So don't shilly-shally. Be kind. Don't violate the fruit of the Spirit. But ask God to give you steel. I don't know if you ought to call it a mean streak, but strength is a good thing. So servanthood and strength are in balance in a good leader in the church. And there's something else I used to teach students, and it's the 90-10 principle. 90% of the people in your church, even if you're in trouble, 90% of those people are God's people, gentle, kind. Some of them will make cookies for you. They'll pray for you every day. And 10%, and by the way, I've checked out these statistics with a whole lot of pastors. We have over 4,000 pastors on our mailing list. And I've asked them, and they say, yeah, that's pretty right, 10-90. The other 10% are mean as snakes. They don't like you. They will never be pleased. They're angry all the time. They're upset all the time. And they're often considered quite spiritual because they talk softly. Let me tell you something. If you minister to that 10%, you'll get regular raises. You won't have many problems in the church. You might even get a bigger church when you leave the present church. But let me tell you something. When it comes your time to die and you look back over your ministry, you'll wince when you think of the people you ignored. But if you minister to the 90%, those who are kind and gentle, God's people who pray for you, who care for your family, if you minister to them, you'll have all kinds of problems. But if you survive, and you might not, because that 10% can be really mean. Excuse me. When I cough, please know I'm suffering pain from these ribs. When you minister the 90%, and if you survive, you'll have a church that is a safe place for them and for you. And maybe the 10% will leave. That's not your goal. Your goal is, of course, to move the 10% into the 90%. But sometimes, frankly, that is really hard. And then I got one other thing to say, and Jesus said it. He said, if they don't accept you, and this applies to you as God's servant, if they don't accept you, shake the dust off your feet, and it will be better for Sodom and Gomorrah than it will be for that town or that house. Jonathan Edwards, you may know this story, was kicked out of his church. And he refused to respond because he knew what Paul said in Romans. Paul said about burning coals and that vengeance belonged to God. And so Jonathan Edwards accepted the people were angry with him, and he left the church, and he was sad, but he never responded. Now let me tell you the rest of the story. The two men who were the most responsible for getting him fired from his church, one went insane and one committed suicide. I made a point of telling that story at least once a year in every church I've ever served. And I would say after I told the story, now you all be careful out there. And then I would laugh and they would laugh, but they heard what I was saying. You belong to God. He's the one who called you. He's the one who put you where you are. And because you are anointed, when people mess with you, they're messing around with God. So instead of just being angry at them, be compassionate and kind, because God does balance those books. Of course, in that course on politics and the church, and how to win the battles without losing your salvation, I taught a lot more, but the time during this breakfast is limited, and that's enough. If I were there, I would then stop and we would discuss some of the controversial things that I said. Since I can't be there, you think about that.